Hello, and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm joined by Scotland's favourite cryptid himself, Mr. Michael Whitehouse. How the heck are you, Mike?
They'll never catch me. They'll never get a photo of me. That's not true. I'm all over the internet. I'm fine, mate. How are you?
I'm good. For a while I've been toying with the idea of looking at some of Scotland's more obscure beasts and monsters and boogeymen. If you're a long-time listener, or you've dug back into our past episodes, you'll know that when we started this podcast, I kicked things off with what became a three-parter on the Loch Ness Monster and other loch monsters of Scotland, which is probably, well, by far I would bet, the most famous sort of thread of Scottish monster lore. But, of course, not every Scottish monster lives in a loch. Scotland has a long history. The well of folklore and legend is very, very deep. However, much of it doesn't have the range of documentation like the modern sightings, the scientific controversy that you get with something like Loch Ness. Some are claimed to exist, some seem to be purely mythological, and although these are certainly worthy of being discussed, they maybe don't all have enough information available to really flesh out, a full 2-hour episode or like a multi-part thing. I'm not going to call this a series or anything like that because I make no promises we'll return to cover other ones in future. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, but it did strike me as a nice idea if we've had a busy month and if we haven't really had time to write and research a full episode, to be able to reach into that deep well and pull out something strange for your listening pleasure. So I want you to imagine, Mike, it's the 1860s and you're a farm worker in northern Aberdeenshire.
Done.
You're ploughing a field next to a tumble-down village graveyard on a clear spring evening. The sun is setting and you're working the final stretch before finishing for the night. Steam rises from the horse's back in the cool dusk air. The buzzing calls of corncrakes sound across the fields. Your mind drifts to thoughts of an armchair maybe, a crackling fire, a warm meal, when suddenly the plough shudders to a halt. The ground collapses beneath the foreshare, opens up, revealing a black cavity in the earth. You swear under your breath, you steady the horse, you walk round to look into the hole, just a black void in the gathering pools of shadow. It takes a few seconds for your eyes to adjust. You wonder if you'll be able to free the plough yourself or if you need to get help from the farmhouse. Beneath you lies what looks like a dug-out tunnel, a burrow of some kind, but it's unlike any burrow you've ever seen. You've worked in the fields all your life, you know a rabbit warren or a molehill when you see it, but this is different, deeper, larger. You could almost crawl through it if you wanted. Its floor is covered in something you can't quite make out, pieces of wood maybe, and then it grabs your eye. There's something moving in the darkness. Only half seen at first, a glimpse of matted, oily fur, white teeth reflecting the last of the sky's daylight, something emerging from the deeper darkness of the tunnel to face the enemy that dared to disturb its subterranean lair. The thing erupts towards you, snarling, hideous, snapping its flesh-stripping jaws. Instinctively you kick out with an iron hobnail boot, a blow that would break the face of a grown man, but instead of being struck down, the beast seizes your boot in a frenzied grip. You're pulled off balance. Your free foot slides in the mud and you slip down towards the pit, with the thing worrying and ripping at the tough leather of your shoe, snipping through the sole like a pair of shears. You're half in the hole now. You're flailing for something to grip hold of to keep yourself out of the stinking ground. Images of suffocating darkness and tiny fangs at your throat flash across your mind. Your hand lands on the swingle tree of your plough. That's a metal bar that hangs from a chain between the horse and the hitch. But instead of supporting your weight, it slips through the loops in the chain and comes free in your hand. You feel the animal loosen its hold on your foot, gearing up to redirect its attack at the softer, unprotected flesh of your thigh. It launches forward, jaws poised to tear open your femoral artery. Screaming, you swing the swingle tree blindly downward. You feel it land across the creature's skull and back with a sharp snap. It falls backwards, scrabbling, convulsing. You swing again, until nothing moves, and the only sounds are your own gasping breaths and the frightened snorting of the horse. You pull yourself free of the ground and look down at the body of the thing in the burrow. It's about 2 feet long, and for a moment you think you've killed some kind of giant rat. But no, the tail is stubbier, bushier, the feet are scooped like those of a mole, the head is dog-like, and it lies amongst the detritus of its nest. Bones, long bones, clavicles, a human skull, and other unspeakable remains strewn across the floor of its tunnel, leading back in the direction of its food source, its larder, the old crumbling graveyard itself. The Earth Hound, also known as the yard swine, yard pig, or Earth Hound, is a figure in Scottish legend with a few claims of actual sightings of an underground burrowing animal that inhabits the land around graveyards and is specialised to feed on the bones and rotting flesh interred there.
This is great. I was imagining the entire time that I looked like Bill Murray from Caddyshack trying to get rid of the gopher.
Maybe that's based on this, who knows? That was an admittedly extremely fictionalised and sensational retelling of a supposed encounter with an Earth Hound, told in a pair of 1917 letters held by the Natural History Department at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. These were written by an A. Smith from the village of Meikle Wortle in Aberdeenshire to an Edinburgh correspondent by the name of James Ritchie. The subject was an acquaintance of Smith's called Archibald, whose father claimed to have been the one who had his boot bitten through by an earth hound that he uncovered while tilling a field near a cemetery about 50 years prior to the date of the letter, and then to have killed it with the plough's swingle tree. Archibald himself claimed to have seen the corpse of the creature as a boy when his father brought it home from the fields. There's a wee bit of inconsistency in the account. In the initial description, in the first letter, it's described as the size, I think it's likened to an extremely large ferret, but then in the second letter, he says something about it being about the size of a rat, which obviously is much smaller, so there's a bit of inconsistency, but he says, quote, asked about colour, he thought it was like a dark rat, it had feet like a mole, and a tail about half as long as a rat's. Head was long and nostrils very prominent, suggesting a pig's. Head somewhat like that of a guinea pig. It had noticeable white tusks, whatever that might mean, probably incisors. So, from the content of the letters, it would seem that belief in the Earth Hound was already something that was present in the area. The witnesses who saw the thing's body identified it as such, identified it as an Earth Hound, based on the understanding that such things existed, that was just something people understood to exist in the environment up there at that time. Mm. There's even information on their habitat preferences. They're said to inhabit churchyards built on or around haughs. So a haugh, H-A-U-G-H, is a Scottish word for a low-lying meadow in the floodplain of a river, where the soil is usually like deep and tillable, and also, presumably easy to dig. So the idea would be that these creatures dig through the soft soil to tear open coffins and eat the flesh of the dead that are interred within the ground.
They're like underground ghouls, Martin.
Yes, well, exactly. And actually,
I love ghoul folklore, by the way. I think, especially in modern cinema and storytelling, I think the ghoul is like the most underrepresented undead creature.
Yeah, it originates in pre-Islamic Arabian polytheism, and ghouls were sort of demonic entities associated with deserts and cemeteries preying on the flesh of the dead. So although the ghoul is much more of an intelligent, sentient being, whereas this is strictly just an animal, there obviously is a kind of similarity. I think more likely than any kind of direct connection between the ghoul and the Earth Hound, because these are widely geographically and culturally different places. Although that doesn't preclude any connection, as we said, with the wild hunt. Obviously these things do spread across wild areas, but I think more likely is that actually it's the whole idea of the bodies of our loved ones being desecrated in some unspeakable way is something that's almost universally loathsome to people across cultures all over the world. But yeah, definitely. That occurred to me as well, the ghoul, the idea of the ghoul. But what interests me that these things, how they are described as just like animals. There's no supernatural qualities attributed to them.
Sounds much more like a subterranean cryptid.
Yeah.
The way you're describing it, it doesn't sound at all like it's anything supernatural about it. It sounds like an animal.
Exactly, and yet we have no evidence that such a creature exists here in Scotland, and it's not a big place, it's not the Pacific Northwest.
No, but I reckon there could be all sorts under the ground, man.
Well, maybe. Cryptozoologist Carl Schuker writes that, independently of the account I've just given, the creature is mentioned in several other sources, including Reverend Walter Gregor's 1881 treatise Notes on the Folklore of North East Scotland, wherein it's referred to, quote, a mysterious dreaded sort of animal called the yerd swine, believed to live in graveyards, burrowing among the dead bodies and devouring them. It's also remarked in the June 1950 edition of the People's Journal, where it's claimed, now this is interesting, it's claimed to just be a local name for rats that happen to inhabit graveyards. So there's a little bit of debatability there as to whether we're really talking about a true cryptid or a true folkloric thing, or we're talking about something that happens naturally with a known animal but is so kind of grotesque that it's kind of entered into folklore on its own. It's almost branched off from the animal itself in a way. Maybe that's an explanation for where this comes from. It's certainly possible. Ethnologist Professor Alexander Fenton, who wrote a journal article in Scottish Studies about the legend, while researching and interviewing people for that article, found the oral legends of the Earth Hound were alive and well in Banffshire as late as 1990. So he was even taken by locals to Walla Kirkyard on the banks of the Deveron, so between Huntly and Dufftown. This graveyard, local people apparently believe to be inhabited by burrowing creatures somewhere between a rat and a rabbit, though he wasn't able to find any trace of them when he visited there. But what I'd be curious to know, if we have any listeners in that part of Scotland, if any of you have ever heard of this. You know, do these stories still circulate today? 1990 is not very long ago. I remember 1990 to age myself. You know, there must still be some degree of, if not belief in this, people must still know about it. It must still be within, the oral legend must still be within living memory at least. But what I find most unusual and compelling about it, as we said, is the sort of the ordinariness of the supposed creatures. Aside from the fact that these are not animals known to science and the gruesome detail of them breaking into coffins to eat the flesh of the dead, there's nothing really, as you say, fanciful about them beyond that. They're not, you know, impossible giants. They're not even particularly big. There's no mystical powers associated with them. They're not said to be, as far as I can find anyway, they're not said to be any sort of omen of disaster. They're not even particularly ugly. You know, the descriptions and the artist's impressions are of a very typical looking rodent that just happens to not quite match any particular known rodent of the area.
Do they usually have tusks, or was that just in the original description?
So tusks, even within the letter itself, the letter is quoting the person who saw the creature is saying to the person who's writing the letter that then was sent to Edinburgh that the creature had tusks, but then the writer of the letter sort of editorializes himself to say tusks, whatever that may mean, probably incisors. So the writer of the letter says that he thinks what they're actually talking about is just sharp incisors, like a dog would have, canines, something like that.
Could it be an invasive species that maybe was brought into Scotland in some part of the country and then it's just sort of remained within the folkloric memory?
Maybe, but then what invasive species, what animal breaks into, I mean, maybe there's something that habitually breaks into...
Did you say 2 feet long?
Yeah, they're not huge, like something about 2 feet long.
Yeah, but for a subterranean animal, that's pretty big though, isn't it? One that's actually burrowing properly, not one that makes a burrow...
Makes a nest.
Because like a badger's a big animal, you know, but...
Yeah, well, they do dig, but yeah, as you say, they make sets. But now you mention that, some have speculated that belief in earth hounds might stem from misidentifications or like a fanciful mythologized version
Yeah.
of the European badger, since badgers have been known to make sets near graveyards and they have been known to dig through graves. But as Carl Schuker notes, it's hard to think of a more familiar and iconic looking British animal than a badger.
Yeah.
You know, it's not an easy animal to mistake for something else, and the descriptions of the Earth Hound don't really chime with a badger. You can't miss that head, you know, the white and the black. And
Yeah, but then also, if you're going back in time to say the origin of this, what sort of spread would the badger populations have in Scotland?
I think they'd be quite widespread. Let me just double check.
I would have thought maybe they would be really pronounced in the lowlands, but maybe not as much in the highlands, but I don't know.
I mean, yeah, they do seem to be just quite widely spread throughout England, Wales, most of Scotland, except for the very far north.
Right.
So Aberdeenshire is quite pastoral. It's not, although it's kind of on the northern side of Scotland, it's not geographically and sort of topologically like the Highlands. It's not really part of the Highlands. It's more, looks sort of like Ayrshire or something, you know. It's very green, it's very, you know, fields and little forests and arable land. It is badger territory, you know. You would think people would know badger when they saw it. Unless, of course, maybe it is just like a creepy critter story made up for the fireside, in which case it might be an invented animal that borrows from badgers and from rats and from ferrets and from moles and is a sort of a composite creature. But again, for a made-up boogeyman creature, it's just so ordinary. If you were going to make something up, you probably would make it more fantastical than it is.
I've got two thoughts about that. The first is that when you look at a lot of Scottish folklore, there are a lot of composite creatures that have, you know,
The haggis.
they have like the physical characteristics of like different animals.
Yeah.
Different animals like almost sort of stitched together. And if it's a purely invented story, then could it have been to stop people from going into graveyards? Because you do wonder sometimes about stories about the eating of the dead and things like that as well, or the tampering with the dead, because there can be disease. But maybe in times of famine, who knows what people have been up to. But you just wonder, could such a story be invented to scare people off from actually? Yeah,
maybe. The thing is, I've maybe done it a bit of a disservice by, in my retelling, making it seem a bit more fearsome than the legend truly makes it out to be.
Yeah.
Apart from it being a bit of a shock finding this thing and then the thing biting through the guy's shoe, which obviously it is quite ferocious, it's not really presented as like this is a threat to living human life. It's more like this is a threat to our places of rest. This is a threat to our dead relatives. So I don't know. One thing though that kind of does make me doubt that these are like a real surviving ongoing species of animal with a breeding population and everything is, in these old rural graveyards, at what rate are people really being interred, and how long does a body actually remain a viable food source for something like this? How long does the flesh really have nutritional value?
If it's something like a rat, I wouldn't put anything past it.
No, I know, but the legends of this thing are attached to really small, really remote graveyards with only like, you know, a few dozen graves in them that have been there, some of them for hundreds of years. So at any one time, some of these graveyards might not have anyone buried there for maybe months at a time or longer. Is there a reliable enough supply of edible flesh to keep these things going for centuries, you know, as a species? Maybe, but it seems like a bit too much of a specialised niche. And maybe a bit of a recent specialised niche, because people have only been burying their dead here for a few thousand years. And early in that time, the population was much less, so there'd be even less people being buried at once and even less food available. I should note, though, that like some graveyards, including that Walla Kirkyard that I mentioned, according to the story, I don't know, I haven't had confirmation of this, although it's something we could probably find out if we went there. There is a story, according to the internet, you know, so take with a pinch of salt, but apparently they stopped burying people there because of these stories. The story was that this graveyard was infested with these flesh-eating creatures, so they stopped interring people there. So it'd be quite interesting
great.
maybe one day to go
That's
there
great. I love this stuff.
and see when the last internment was, or if there was a big gap in internment.
Just makes you think of Tremors.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I think there was a movie about giant underground rats that ate the dead as well.
Right, yeah.
I think there was, because in the article, was it called The Dark or something? I think the Carl Schuker article that I read mentioned it.
That's not a novel, is it?
Maybe it was originally.
Because I've got, when you're saying that in my head, I've got a picture of something with an illustration, and I'm wondering if it's like either the cover of a book or a poster for a movie. But it sounds very familiar. Sounds as if it's a movie.
Yeah, so part of me does still wonder, maybe, if I'm to really open myself up to the kind of juicier but less likely scenarios, maybe there was some original kernel of weird truth to this, where perhaps somewhere up there in Aberdeenshire there was some kind of a mutation occurred in a rat or a mole that gave it some physical differences, maybe larger size, maybe a stronger, more canine set of jaws, just enough to kind of give it an advantage in being able to inhabit graveyards or to dig through that kind of soil, or even to break into graves and eat carrion. It has some short or medium term success in scavenging for food this way. It reproduces and passes these adaptations to its offspring. But this could be a case of like an evolutionary stub, an evolutionary dead end, where these slightly altered rodents come up against those supply issues that I was thinking of, and then die out after a few generations, or the adaptations prove less beneficial over time and they're bred out, but not before leaving a mark in human folktales. It's really unlikely, don't get me wrong, but, you know, it's not impossible. We talked in the Loch Ness episode about ferox trout, which are a variant, some call them a subspecies of brown trout, which have adapted to deep water lakes and have become piscivorous, which means they eat other fish instead of insects and eggs and whatnot that a normal brown trout would prey on. Taxonomically, ferox trout are, for all intents and purposes, still brown trout, but they look quite different. They're larger, they're longer lived, they have more powerful jaws, so maybe the Earth Hound was some comparable variation of like a known native animal that has since died out, you know, like a subspecies of rat or a subspecies of mole that just found this niche where for a while it was able to, a few generations were able to subsist eating human flesh and had slight adaptations to allow them to do that, because of course rodents have very fast generational turnaround. So, you know, you can get, I think rats and mice, you can have multiple generations within a year. I think you can have 5-6 generations in a year. So if you have one very successful rat, for example, and it's very successful because it has some slight anatomical difference to the other rats, and it, you know, it's able to really pig out on flesh which other rats don't have access to because they don't have these adaptations to allow them to reach it, then it's going to have loads of offspring, and its offspring might inherit those anatomical differences. So, you know what, maybe that's a possibility. I don't think so, but it's a kind of little glimmer of a possibility, I think, for there to be something genuinely strange and something that genuinely did exist and did dig around eating human flesh in the graveyards of Aberdeenshire. Again, maybe one day we could take a trip up to that kirkyard.
I'd love that.
And see what we can find.
Road trip. I have to say, Martin, with these sorts of stories, I'm actually maybe further along in the being open to there actually having been something.
Yeah.
I suppose the reason for that is, first, you're talking about something that could be permanently subterranean, that never really comes up, or very rarely comes up out of the ground. And you could be talking about something that is maybe extinct now, but existed.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people overestimate how easy it is to actually find animal bones.
Yeah.
I was listening to a conversation the other day, for the life of me, I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about Bigfoot, right? And they were talking about, now Bigfoot is something that I'm much more skeptical about, right, in North America. However, one of the arguments that gets made against Bigfoot is that why don't we find the bones?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there's creatures like Gigantopithecus and, you know, that lived at some point in the distant past. and they found very few of the bones of that species of ape, but seems quite similar to what people describe as Bigfoot. But anyway, paleontologists, they'll put together an entire species off of like one tiny little piece of bone.
Yeah.
And the thing is, when they're talking about Bigfoot, the point was made that, and this was a hunter was talking about it, and was talking about how they go into areas where there's bear, a high population of bear, they're always there, and and they said, and I don't know how truthful this is because I'm not a hunter myself and I'm not in areas where there's a lot of bears, but they said, I have hunted all my life and I have never ever found bear bones anywhere. I've never found a bear carcass, and it's very, very rare to actually find because everything just consumes it.
Yeah.
So I think with stories like this, I'm not saying that it definitely exists, it probably doesn't, but I'm much more open to the idea that there could be something that's subterranean that hasn't been discovered yet, that has maybe quietly died out.
Yeah.
And there's no real record of it in the fossil record yet, because the fossil record is tiny for everything. It's tiny.
Here's the thing though, right? If it's not a more recent mutation or adaptation of something that is sort of endemic, right? If it's something that's ancient that has then died out, what did it live on before people were burying their dead? What was it? Because if it's adapted to break into coffins and to inhabit graveyards, what was it doing before people came along? These creatures are associated only with graveyards. Nobody claims to have ever met one in a field. Now, in fairness, there's very little literature about them, so maybe it's just complete lack of information, but one thing that does bother me with that is that if it is so specialised to eat human flesh and interred in the ground human flesh, why would a carrion eater be adapted to dig underground?
Yeah, totally. But then I would also say, well, maybe it preyed upon other subterranean creatures. Maybe it did eat primarily maybe
it ate tremors.
Maybe it ate Kevin Bacon.
They died out and then it went on.
Kevin Bacon died out. Maybe they fed on other animals before then, or insects, and maybe they had another. And like the thing is, well, I think they're realising that certainly when it comes to transmitted behavioural changes within animal populations, that it doesn't take a lot sometimes for an entire population of animal to change its behaviour. And I think that there was a theory, it was a controversial one, I think it's still controversial, in evolutionary biology. I think it's called punctuated equilibrium, maybe. That yes, evolutionary changes happen extremely slowly for the most part, but you actually do get these very focused moments in history where there is actually a very large jump.
When evolutionary pressure is applied because of a disaster or an event that then forces them to start filling other niches and that kind of thing.
I think, as far as I remember reading about that, it was an idea that you could get something mutating markedly, so not just a switch in behaviour, we're talking about a large jump. Now, it would be very, very rare. It would be very rare for that to happen, but if it's possible, I mean, obviously this is all highly speculative, but could it be something, when you hear these stories, could it be something that existed previously that then became something else? And plus... Okay,
so if we go, there's a completely unknown animal that existed, that lived into modern times, and then it adapted to do this other thing, and what we've got is like not just the unknown animal, but like an adaptation from an unknown animal. We could just save a step and say it could just be something we already know about that adapted to fill this niche, which then brings us back to maybe it's a rat or a ferret or something that has just slightly changed from what we know it as, like the ferox trout thing. But it could be something completely unknown. Nature has a habit of surprising us.
And the wonderful thing about folklore is that it could stem from this one moment. Like you said, could there have been a graveyard where there was this, even just this one single animal, never mind it passing on its traits, but this one single animal that was found, and the local people finding it and saying, well, this is a bit bizarre, what is this? Exactly, and then those stories get passed on.
A single moment is transmitted down through time. Because how often do we see, like, a goat is born with 3 heads, all with one eye in them,
That's right.
something's born and people somewhere think it's a manifestation of Vishnu because it's got all these legs or whatever. You know, mutations happen, and sometimes they're not viable and they die right away, and sometimes they do survive. Yeah, maybe it was just a one-off. Maybe it was a whole species. Maybe it was a subspecies. Maybe it was just a fireside story someone made up. But there's just something about it. There's just something very, really fascinating about it, almost in its mundanity, if that's a word.
Yeah.
Definitely has the feel of something real, but I can't quite put my finger on how it's real. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's the Earth Hound. I did say it was a short subject. I would love to do more of these obscure Scottish monsters, stuff like the Grey Man of Ben Macdooey, the Shelley Coat, the Wolver. You know, when you dig down, there's just so many weird Scottish beasties.
Yeah, and there's ones I would love to cover as well, because the very first play that I wrote for the No Sleep podcast was just before the tours happened, and it was kind of like a tester. We did it on the show to see how it would go down, and it was, if anyone that listens to the No Sleep podcast, it's called A Draw to the Listener, and it's about a group of people basically telling stories to each other one night, and then there's an overarching part of that about how the act of telling scary stories and frightening stories can attract something from the darkness. And the Shelley Coat was part of those stories, because I remember reading about this thing that rattles.
Yeah, as it walks.
As it walks. I actually thought Shelley Coat sounds like such a silly name, but the image of that to me, you know, where it's just covered in all these shells and it rattles on seaweed.
Yeah.
To me, that was quite a frightening idea, you know, and then it's also associated to like the washroom and all that.
Yeah, there's a painting of the Shelley Coat where it basically looks like the thing from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah.
It's got that Gillman head.
Oh, I'd love to see that. But yeah, like, because I'm recently, believe it or not, I've actually been looking at wanting to get back into studying something just part-time. And I've not made up my mind what I want to study, but I think it is going to be along the lines of either archaeology or folklore.
Right.
It's something that's becoming more and more interesting to me as I get older, so it would be great to cover some of these things, because like you say, Scotland has a wealth of folklore. Every country does, but I think the saddest thing in some ways about folklore is that the vast majority of it isn't written down, so a lot of these stories are lost over time. That's why I think folklorists actually become quite important.
I've just sent you that picture of the Shelley Coat.
Yeah. Is it Alan Lee? Did he not used to do a lot of the illustrations for Tolkien stuff?
I have no idea. Quite possibly, yeah. There's a book called Fairies, which is written and illustrated by English artists Brian Froud and Alan Lee, who, yes, that's him.
Yeah.
That's him. So yeah, that is the Earth Hound.
Great stuff. I enjoyed that very much. Some of my favourite stories and favourite myths revolve around churchyards. My dad used to take me to churchyards when I was a kid, which was very interesting because he wasn't religious. He was agnostic at best, if not atheist, but he loved churches, and I love churches as well. He sort of instilled that in me, and he loved graveyards, and he used to always take me to graveyards, and there's still places that I love to visit. I think they are serene and creepy and peaceful all at the same time.
They're very liminal.
Yeah. They're places that I enjoy going to. I used to read about people. It's not really a common hobby anymore. People used to take rubbings of gravestones, take like the tracing paper and put it over the gravestone.
Yeah, that's right, with a crayon.
Yeah. But I'd probably get arrested.
There's a man rubbing himself.
I know, he's rubbing himself against that gravestone. But do you know one thing that's funny? I'll tell you. For all my dad claimed to be atheist and agnostic, I always remember he really told me off once because we were in a graveyard and I ran across the graves, and he was really explained to me, he's just like, you never step on a grave ever, you know. And just always found that interesting. There was always wee suggestions with my dad. I know that when he was at university, he got interested in certain things to do, not practicing, but he got interested in the history of the occult, and he read up on it a great deal and studied it. And I know that he stopped doing that because he thought it had a bit of a negative effect on his mindset. for someone who was so sceptical,
Yeah, interesting.
there was always that wee suggestion in him that, as sceptical as he was, because like towards the end of his life, I remember him telling me, he says, I pray every night. And I was really surprised, and I said, why? I said, you don't believe? And he's like, I don't know why I pray. He says, but I always have ever since I was a wee boy.
Yeah.
But it's a funny thing. But anyway, sorry, that's a tangent.
We will be back soon with another episode. Do you think we'll get the Paisley Witches Part 2 out soon?
Yeah, definitely. It's just because of COVID and all that it just... I know we've had messages with people asking for it, and it's definitely coming.
I think any day now we're going to have trading standards at the door.
I know. If you think that's bad, it's been a year since an episode of Fear Noir was put out. I've had a right few messages from people about that, but
yeah.
It's all coming together. But definitely the Paisley Witches episodes, it's already half written. It's just because COVID and a few other things. But I will redouble my efforts to get that done so that we can get that out.
Cool. So it might be that, it might be something else, but we'll be back soon with another Talking Till Dawn. But for now, I think I see the sun rising over those broken gravestones.
The sun's coming up.
Thank you folks for listening, and take care.
Good night.